Do you dread negotiations for fear of the conflict involved? The fact is that every aspect of our lives involves some form of negotiation. From a salary discussion to a child's bedtime, a business deal to a high-stakes hostage crisis. In these situations, the only way to get what you think is right is to ask for it. In Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, former expert FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss details that the best way to do this is to use a set of tools that allows you to better connect with others, influence them, and negotiate for what you want. Core principles of negotiation. First, the new rules. Hostage-taking has existed for thousands of years. We can come across some cases in the Old Testament and the history of the Roman Empire. However, hostage negotiating was very primitive, as it only meant sending troops to set hostages free using weapons. Things changed only in the 8th century, after several incidents when many hostages were killed. Police forces started organizing groups of experts to conduct negotiations. In 1979, the Harvard negotiation process was founded to develop a theory and practice of negotiation which could be applied not only in hostage-taking situations, but in business as well. However, they presented negotiations as a rational process, assuming that the emotional brain is not something of importance. As it appeared later, this was a flawed approach. Two professors from the University of Chicago, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, argued that humans by their nature are never rational or stable. Their research proved that the human subconscious distorts the way we see the objective world. They discovered more than 150 cognitive biases. This is why Kahneman was convinced that trying to conduct negotiations based on logical thinking while ignoring emotional intellect was useless. Like trying to make an omelet without first knowing how to crack an egg, as he put it, without a deep understanding of human psychology, without the acceptance that we are all crazy, irrational, impulsive, emotionally driven animals. All the raw intelligence and mathematical logic in the world is little help in the fraught, shifting interplay of two people negotiating. Taking this into account, the FBI started training their agents using psychological systems based on listening and manipulating. All people want to be understood and accepted. So showing empathy and a desire to understand can open the door to a successful negotiation. Second, be a mirror. Voss tells a story of a bank robbery that happened in 1993. Two masked robbers stormed into a bank, taking 3 hostages, 2 female tellers and a security guard. To save them, several law enforcement agencies arrived. Voss's task was to coach the police department negotiator, Joe. So while Joe was on the phone, 4 other people were listening attentively to the conversation, making notes and comparing them. Voss explains that this was done because people often listen selectively, losing important pieces of information. So, relying only on yourself is not a productive way of listening. Besides, very often we get too preoccupied with the voices in our own heads, our thoughts and ideas, which don't let us hear their counterpart. To avoid this, we need to actually focus on the person we are listening to. Another thing, continues Voss, is to not make assumptions. The lead hostage-taker was trying to convince the police that there were other co-conspirators with him, saying that he was not in charge. It was easy to assume that he would surrender quickly and easily as he kept saying he was scared. However, it was just an assumption. As Voss says, assumptions need to be taken as hypotheses, not as facts. If the police had shared optimism with the press too early, they would have been humiliated, because the assumption never proved to be right. Talking to the hostage-taker, they used other techniques to get information out of him. Voss emphasizes that it was very important to speak in the right voice, inflecting it downward, which he calls a late-night FM DJ voice. Another trick was to slow it down, not hurrying things up since it could make the robber feel he was not being heard, and of course mirroring, repeating back what the robber was saying. Mirroring is especially effective, says the author, because it lets us develop an instinct of connection that encourages trust. To make it work, it is critically important to make pauses after the phrase "you mirror." Mirroring needs silence. This way, you let a person talk more and the information he doesn't want to give out. Third, don't feel their pain. Label it. In 1998, 3 fugitives, who had used automatic weapons in a shootout with a rival gang 7 days earlier, were holed up in an apartment. An FBI SWAT team was in the hallway. Snipers were on rooftops. The situation was tense. They needed to talk to the fugitives. The fugitives kept silent, but Voss was talking to them, speaking through the apartment door. He didn't make orders. Instead, he tried to imagine himself in their place. As he says, even though standard negotiating advice is to keep a poker face, it is impossible to separate people from their emotions. Instead of ignoring emotions, it makes sense to identify and then influence them. And what's even more important, to label them. Once you've spotted a particular emotion, says the author, you should name it aloud since it will encourage your counterpart to be more responsive. Labeling is a very effective de-escalating method because it allows a person to acknowledge his or her feelings. This works really well with anger. This emotion releases stress hormones that disrupt the ability to properly act in a situation. The same concerns the feeling of fear. By labeling someone's fears, you can generate a feeling of safety. Voss kept talking to the fugitives, saying he knew they didn't want to go back to jail, and he knew they were scared to go out because the police could open fire. Paying attention to what the fugitives were feeling and helping them realize it, Voss created an environment of trust. After 6 hours, the fugitives went out fourth. At some point in his career, Voss had to work at the crisis hotline. The rule was that a person could make only 1 call per day, and it could last no more than 20 minutes. However, there were people who wanted to talk much more. Energy vampires, as Voss called them. One of them was Daryl, a guy who was worried about losing a house. In a conversation with him, Voss tried to calm him down, going back and forth and persuading him that his fears were mostly made up. Daryl agreed with what he was saying and even thanked him for support. After they finished, Voss had an impression that he did a great job. However, his colleague said it was one of the worst calls he'd ever heard. What was the problem? As Voss understood later, he didn't let Daryl lead the conversation, making him feel responsible for making conclusions. The conversation finished with Daryl's yes. But in fact, there should have been more no. Voss says that saying no is a powerful instrument for several reasons. First of all, it allows us to bring up real problems, instead of falsely agreeing with everything. Secondly, it gives people an opportunity to think more carefully and make correct decisions. Thirdly, by saying no, people feel more in control and emotionally comfortable since, in a way, they protect themselves. No is not a sign of failure. It only means that a person wants a little more time. Definitely, the final goal of any negotiation is yes, but it should not come in the beginning, underlines Voss. An objection or a refusal actually gives more space for discussion, while niceness, which is often associated with yes, can be useless. Fifth, trigger the 2 words that immediately transform the negotiation. In 2000, the militant Islamic group kidnapped a man called Jeffrey Schilling. The leader of the group, who negotiated the price for Schilling's head, $10 million, was Abu Sabaya, a person with a history of rape, murder, and beheadings. Sabaya negotiated with Benji, a military officer. At first, Benji hated the idea of developing a rapport with the terrorist as the FBI recommended. However, he changed his viewpoint and did use the recommended techniques, mirroring, labeling, and so on. Sabaya was silent for a minute and then said 2 words. That's right. Eventually, he released his hostage without any ransom. Carefully studying the scripts afterward, Voss noticed that Sabaya changed his course after he uttered those 2 words. That's right. So what was so special about them? Saying that's right explains Voss. People show that they have analyzed what you have said and confirmed it out of their own free will. It is a point when they admit they have heard you. Sixth, bend their reality. Back in 2004, on Monday morning, kidnappers captured a famous Haitian political figure and demanded $150,000 as a ransom. Her nephew was terrified and was ready to pay the money. His logic was simple. He would pay the ransom, and they would release his aunt. But negotiations, as Voss points out, are never a linear formula. There always are blind spots and hidden needs. This could be a political deal, but Haitian criminals used more brutal methods for those. And there was another small detail that made the FBI think this case was not politically motivated. The kidnappers wanted the money by Friday. Listening to them carefully, the FBI realized that they needed money for partying over the weekend. Was $150,000 an appropriate sum for partying? Probably not. A reasonable thing to do was to split the difference and offer them $75,000. But was it a good idea? Compromises in negotiations, says Voss, are often ineffective and disastrous. We compromise not because it is the right thing to do, but because it's easy and guarantees that we will achieve at least something. Compromising, we are usually driven by fear. Seventh, create an illusion of control. 2001, they raided a private resort and took 20 hostages. Unfortunately, this case was doomed to failure. In the middle of negotiations, the Philippine army raided the kidnappers, pissing them off. As a result, several hostages got killed and raped, and the group eventually joined Al-Qaeda. An interesting thing about this situation was that while the FBI was trying to save the hostages, there was another person running a parallel negotiation. And, unlike the FBI, he got to speak for one of the hostages, for free. How did he manage that? Analyzing the situation back home, Voss made the conclusion that a huge mistake the FBI was constantly making was that they were always afraid to ask for something. For example, they were afraid to ask for proof that a hostage was alive because the kidnapper would ask something back. Or they were afraid if they asked to talk to the hostage, the answer would be no. It was clear that they had to find ways to get what they needed without directly asking. Voss says that this case was his professional nightmare, which, at the same time, helped him look at negotiations from a different angle. So he and his team developed a tool that gives the counterpart an impression that he is in control, when in fact, you are the one defining the conversation. This tool is calibrated or open-ended questions. Calibrated questions, says Voss, are like directions. You choose where you want the conversation to go and let your counterpart lead you both there. There are rules to making a calibrated question. Avoid words like can, is, are, do, or does, since these questions can be answered only with yes or no. The best way to start a question, if you want to get some valuable information, is to use how and what. It may seem that you are very limited, having only 2 words to operate with. However, almost every question can be calibrated with how and what. For example, does this look like something you would like? Can become, how does this look to you? Voss further provides some examples of sentences that can be used during negotiations. What about this is important to you? What are we trying to accomplish here? How would you like me to proceed? Using calibrated questions, we can literally make our counterpart do the job for us, and yet make him believe he has all the control. Eighth, guarantee execution. Another story is about a group of inmates armed with knives who took the warden and some of the staff hostage during a prison siege in St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. They didn't really want to hurt the hostages, says Voss. They wanted to get out of the siege unharmed, preferably as soon as possible. But they didn't trust the police. So negotiators came up with a simple plan. They would let the inmates out one by one, giving the person who was leaving a radio. So once he passed the 3 perimeters, he could call the other inmates and let them know he didn't get beaten before getting transferred to jail. However, the plan didn't work. Before the first person climbed in the van, one of the guys noticed the radio and took it away. He didn't know about the plan. It all failed. We should always remember that almost always there are other players, says Voss. We need to take into account the people behind the table. He continues that, to guarantee the execution, you should make sure that your counterpart does not lie to you. You can use the 738-55 rule, which means that 7% of your message is based on words, while 38% is on voice tone and 55% on body language. Your task is to see if the words match up with the body language and tone. There is also the rule of 3, which requires a person to agree with something 3 times in one conversation. Since it is very hard to fake the same thing 3 times, you can spot the lie. Finally, you can use the Pinocchio effect. According to it, the more a person lies, the more words he says. His nose doesn't grow like Pinocchio's, but his speech does. 9th. Bargain ahead. Out of all types of negotiation, bargaining is probably the one that causes the most anxiety and aggression. To open this chapter, the author tells a story about him buying a red Toyota. Even though he was not the only person obsessed with the truck, Voss was able to negotiate a price, but it took him a lot of mental energy. To make the process easier, says Voss, you need to learn to see psychological nuances that direct the way you and your counterpart act. Every person has his own negotiation style that has been formed during his life, impacted by a variety of factors. Recognizing these styles, you can adjust your behavior and make the negotiations more effective. 10th. Find the black swan. On June 17, 1981, William Griffin left his house and went to a bank, killing his mother and several other people on his way, including police officers reacting to the siren alarm and people just walking by. Getting in the bank and taking hostages, he made the manager call the police and say that either you come to the front entrance doors of the bank at 3 o'clock and have a shootout with him in the parking lot, or he's going to start killing hostages and throwing out bodies. At exactly 3 o'clock, he told one of his hostages to walk to the door and shot her. At this point, it was obvious that he didn't want money or anything. His only purpose was to leave the bank in a body bag. This behavior was something nobody expected or could even think of. However, it did happen. Before that, nobody killed a hostage on deadline. To describe situations like this, when something that you think is impossible happens, Voss uses the black swan metaphor. Until the 17th century, people didn't believe they existed. They knew only about white swans. Black swan theory tells us that things happen that were previously thought to be impossible or never thought of at all. This is not the same as saying that sometimes things happen against 1 in a million odds, but rather that things never imagined do come to pass. He explains that in any negotiation there are 3 types of information. Known knowns are things you know for sure, like your counterpart's name. Unknown knowns is something you know that exists, but you don't know if it happens in this particular situation. For example, your counterpart may get sick and leave. And finally, unknown unknowns are things we've never thought of, like the suicide by cop case described above. These are black swans. Conducting negotiations, says Voss, you should be prepared to face black swans. However, people by nature are not ready to embrace the unknown because it scares us. We tend to label something unknown as crazy. Final. Thoughts on Chris Voss's book. Summary. The book, Never Split the Difference, offers the first-hand experience of negotiation through the author's application of these skills in real-life situations. Chris believes in the importance of psychological skills to build an agreement, gain faith, and win control while maintaining good relationships with our counterparts. Our Never Split the Difference book summary would have given you a clear idea of the author's thoughts. We feel this book is sure to give you a competitive edge in life. The use of examples to support the statement is an added advantage that keeps the reader hooked. A well-structured book that you would love to revisit. from time to time to gain its timeless wisdom.
If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe, like, and activate the notification bell to get all the latest updates. What book would you like us to summarize in the next video?